Welcome to Beyond the Razor Wire Fence. I'm Kelly Sheard, the director of the Gender Wealth Institute within Women's Way. Our mission is to advance gender and racial equity by building collective power to disrupt systems of oppression and strengthen alternative models centered in inclusion, love, and liberation. Over the last 7 months, Women's Way facilitated a narrative change fellowship with 7 women and gender-expansive individuals with experiences of incarceration and reentry. With help from Love Now Media, our fellows honed their storytelling skill set to advocate for economic equity in Philadelphia. This podcast centers their stories. Beyond the Razor Wire Fence asserts that incarceration is a form of wealth extraction. Moreover, through this podcast, fellows depict the disproportionately deep impact for women, trans, and gender-expansive people. The fellows' stories dive deep into how the carceral system perpetuates the gender wealth gap and calls attention to the institutionalized strategies of extraction before, during, and after incarceration. Through a combination of interviews, storytelling, and research, the fellows challenge assumptions around incarceration and advocate for a shift in policy and culture to move us closer to a liberatory economy. This episode features Pam Superville. We'll hear from her, listen to her in conversation with our friends from Love Now Media, and finally we'll welcome Jackie Johnson from Sankofa Healing Studio, who will sit down with Diane to add context to the terminology and information introduced by Pam. Welcome, Pam. This episode contains mention of intimate partner violence, drug use, and child abuse.
Hi, my name is Pam. I'm the mother of 2 amazing children. I work as a re-entry professional. My focus is actually helping justice-impacted individuals to successfully reintegrate after their incarceration. And I also was born in the beautiful island of Trinidad and Tobago, but I'm a Philadelphian by adoptee, and I'm enjoying it. When I look back on my life, I can see the choices, the many bad choices that I made. They were like the cobblestones that led me down the pathway to my incarceration. Looking for men in all the wrong places, developing behaviors that, unknown to me at that time, were triggered by the trauma-informed experiences that I was having, and also the fact that I made a choice to self-medicate with marijuana and became very addicted to it with some of those bad choices that I made. I had my daughter for a man who only fit the criteria of looking good and being good and talking good, but he was not nice to me. I had to actually run away from Trinidad with the help of my new boo, who I met many years later, because my daughter's father was so bad to me. I moved to the States, left my mother, my child, my friends, my relatives, and came here with this gentleman who he was able to support us lucratively because he was an artist, he was a musician, and he worked with his hands. He got me into a very nice home, he married me, and we had our son. But by the time my son was about 4 or 5 years, my husband started mentally, physically abusing my son and I. Additionally, during this time period, I was beginning to suffer with mental depression and sadness and loneliness because the fact of reality was I had no friends or relatives here. So Christmases and birthdays and times like that really started affecting me. My husband, who was a marijuana smoker, introduced me to weed, telling me, in the days when you're feeling bad, smoke some weed. I did, and over time became addicted to it. But along this pathway, what I did not realize, by the time my son was in middle school, my husband's behavior became very erratic. He became very violent. He would smash plates in the sink if I didn't wash dishes on time. But I didn't realize that my husband in addition to using weed, had become a crack cocaine user. And over time, he started to more physically and mentally abuse my son and I. I thought about leaving. And one day I actually did. When he left for work, I put some stuff in a bag. But when I got to the door, Mr. Gender Wealth Gap was there reminding me, girl, you only have $200 in your pocket. That would only pay for a couple of nights hotel. You ain't got no friends, no relatives here. Where you going? You ain't got no money. He is your sole supporter. So I went back and set my behind down and stayed. But like I said, over the years, the beatings, the abuse, the cursing, I mean, it was shameful. But my son and I had to experience, and then what started bothering me is the fact that my son, who was a brilliant student, his grades started dropping. I would get calls from the school that he was truant. And I too, like I said, already dealing with my loneliness and dealing with, having to cover up some of the abuses, I started feeling real badly. I planned on leaving again, but the way I was going to leave, I was just going to tell my parents, my family who knew nothing about what I was experiencing, I was just going to ask them for money and get on a plane and take my son and I. But what really pushed things to the front, one Sunday morning, my husband sent my son to get a newspaper. And he was very upset that my son, the newspaper run did not take more than 10 minutes normally, but my son was out there talking with his friends. And ladies and gentlemen, when my son walked into our living room, my husband grabbed my son and slapped him so hard that it left his fingerprint in my son's face. I blacked out. Truth be told, I did not remember this until recently when I saw my son, who is currently incarcerated, and he reminded me of this incident. That was the day when I ran without shoes down to the 18th Police District to have that man. I could have had him arrested. I said, no, just get him from the house. And that was when my son and I got a break. But that break was very short-lived. The euphoria, my son was happy. But for me, that euphoria was short-lived. Because about a week or so, one day I came home from work and sitting on my sofa again, Mr. Gender Wealth Gap saying, girl, he gone. Look at the amount of bills that you have unpaid sitting on that table. You're now solely responsible for your son, all his financial needs, and now he's getting into teenage years. You know he needs a lot. He also reminded me, this is the second week you have copped from the weed man and you didn't give him no money. Girl, you're setting yourself up for failure. So I started asking myself, how do I make ends meet? I made another bad choice when, in order to do this, I chose to embezzle money from my employers to pay my bills. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was the final cobblestone that led me behind those razor wire fences. During my incarceration, I learned a lot. There's a lot that goes on behind razor wire fences that the world is not aware of. Many incarcerated women have mental health, drug and alcohol, and/or substance abuse. Many incarcerated women are holding the bag, were locked up for holding the bag for the man who actually did the crime, but they chose the incarceration. Many incarcerated women, like myself, were victims of domestic abuse.
A note of context from Women's Way. I want to talk a little bit about the relationship between domestic violence and incarceration. What we just heard from Pam about the women she met in the prison she was incarcerated at is not an isolated experience. In fact, women's prisons and jails are full of survivors of intimate partner violence, or IPV, and domestic violence, DV. Around 75% of women who have been incarcerated have experienced domestic violence. That's 3 times more than the general population of women. Many women who are incarcerated are facing sentences that are linked to the domestic violence or intimate partner violence they experienced, such as self-defense, substance abuse disorder developed due to domestic violence-related trauma, or crimes that their abuser coerced them into committing. Despite the large population of survivors in jails and prisons, there are virtually no healing and rehabilitation programs for survivors in prison. We'll hear more about this from Pam in a moment. Check the show notes for links to our sources and more information. Let's get back to the show.
I also learned that incarceration does not guarantee rehabilitation. Case managers are not skilled to help us with the traumas that we have experienced. I also learned that you can get a job behind the walls, sure. But you know the salaries? Salaries start at 19 cents an hour, and they can go as high as 50 cents an hour. I had a 50-cent job. But when I got my paycheck, I had to make a choice to either call home to my family by phone cards or buy tampons and pads and basic feminine needs that the prisons don't give to you for free. So I asked God to help me get out of prison successfully. It was a journey, but when I did come home, I decided to put some action items on the table and work towards it. And as a re-entry professional, I'm able to do that. But I'm here today asking you who, within the sound of my voice, let's push for some stuff. Action plan number 1. Let's ask for increased salaries for justice-impacted people so that they can support themselves during their incarceration. Action item number 2. Let's insist that there are trainings, parenting trainings, job readiness trainings, vocational trainings for justice-impacted individuals, and also train the case managers who work behind the walls to be able to address the trauma-informed experiences and behaviors of the people that they serve. And my final action item is asking us all, it's election time now, pushing our politicians and our legislators to put policies in place, solid policies, grants, and follow-ups on the grants that they're being offered, to put policies and monies in place to help justice-impacted individuals rehabilitate their lives, reconnect with their children, give them the parenting tools behind the razor wire fences and beyond the razor wire fences to be good parents so they could reconnect with their children and to get over the low self-esteem and stigmas that they face. And my call today is, there is unity in numbers. And I really believe that we as a people can make this change. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nicole Blackson with Love Now Media, and today I will be speaking with fellow Pamela Superville. Thank you for joining me, Ms. Pam. Thank you for laying out those call to actions so clearly.
Thank you. I mean, it's in my heart, and it's what's needed.
Yeah. So I want to start a little bit way back.
Okay, way back.
2 things that I heard that was very core to your experience. Relationships, you said choosing bad men, and then you talk about domestic violence. Could you remember when you were younger, what would make you gravitate towards certain men?
I just like the flashiness.
Okay.
I just like the way that, to me, the schoolboys were too dull.
You need a little excitement.
Right, no excitement. And the guys in the corner, the guys who would always say, "How you looking good, hi, tick, ting," and that kind of stuff, that turned me on, and I always gravitated to the rude boys.
And I think it's important to ask that because I feel like you're not alone. To your point, when you were in the carceral system, many women were there because of their intimate partner relationships.
Exactly.
Right? So those choices tend to have a big effect. So what excites you now?
The work that I do.
Yeah.
Helping justice-impacted individuals, going into rooms and not care who is not agreeing with me, say what I know and not what somebody else feels. In the work that I'm doing, you meet a lot of quote-unquote professionals who are book taught. Mm-hmm. But like I keep reminding them, I'm justice impacted. I've lived the life. I know what women need. And with all due respects to you, sis, I think you're wrong.
Yeah.
And I stand by my beliefs.
Yeah, I think lived experience is so palpable when you're talking to people who you're trying to help get to maybe where you are, right? What's one of those tools or resources that you feel like every justice-impacted woman needs?
Like I said earlier, justice-impacted sisters need to be encouraged. They need to feel that there is not a number on your forehead or a number on your back. They need for people to stop stigmatizing them because of their criminal records. They need to know that if I was able to come home and do it, I had nothing when I came home.
Yeah.
But they need to know that despite what the world says, you got to push forward. You got to have a voice. And once given that opportunity, walk into that door with boldness and show the skills and abilities that you have. Somebody's going to like you.
Yeah, yeah. And I think for me, one thing I notice about your story is that you often describe yourself as a mother first. I'm going to start a sentence, and I want you to finish it. As a mother, I made the decision to
really try to make a difference in my kids' life now. My kids felt abandoned. When I came home, that was something I didn't get a chance to talk about. My kids really felt that I had abandoned them because guess what? My daughter was in Trinidad.
Yeah.
I came up here, had another child, and then my son suddenly had to deal with the fact that I was in jail. My daughter, as a child, she didn't know what was going on with me. So 2 different situations of abandonment. So I had to come home. And I thank God for the life that I have now. They see me as a professional. They see me as an advocate. They see me as a God-fearing woman who made some bad mistakes in her early life, but who has always loved them. I used to write my daughter. Some of the letters she got. Some of them she never read. But I always wrote my daughter, letting my daughter know that even though we so far away, you in Trinidad, one of these days, daughter, I'm going to get you up here and we're going to have a life. And thank God that is happening right now.
Yeah.
My daughter now lives with me. Well, she doesn't live with me. She lives in Philly. She lived with me for a while. And she came up. She's a bank manager. She's doing very, 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 very well. On the other side, my son, because of all the trauma that we suffered at his father's hands, my son is still currently incarcerated. But I know he's going to come home.
Yeah. So we're seeing how some of those cycles, the trauma repeats itself. If you could say anything to the mothers who are in the carceral system to encourage them, what would it be? To connect with their family while they're there, but also once they are returning?
What I would say to mothers, sometimes do not feel selfish about your incarceration. Do not feel selfish that the world has turned against you and you're in a place where nobody cares about you. Think about the children that you've left at home. And especially if you're blessed to have a family member taking care of that child. Like if you have to make the decision to not eat for a month and buy a phone card, like I said earlier, like I used to have to do, I would reach out so that they would hear your voice. Do not give up on your family, especially if you have kids, despite how bad it is, whatever you're experiencing behind prison walls.
Yeah, that consistent contact.
You have to stay in touch with your children. And children remember stuff. My daughter would tell me things that I didn't remember because my mother would read some of the letters to her. Yeah. You know? So even though when I came home, my daughter did not talk to me for a minute. Because like I said, she went through that abandonment stuff. And she thought my son was better off than her when she realized that he was locked up.
Yeah.
So, I say, do not forget your kids at home at all.
Hi again, this is Kelly from Women's Way. I want to talk about the impact of incarceration on family separation. Incarceration separates millions of mothers from their children each year. The Prison Policy Initiative reported in 2022 that 60% of women in prison are mothers, and 80% of women in jail are mothers. The Adoption and Safe Families Act of 1997 requires states to terminate parental rights to children who have been in foster care for 15 of the last 24 months, with no exception for incarcerated parents. The average sentence for a woman in prison is 18 months, which means that family separation is a reality for most incarcerated women. As the number of women in prison increases each year, family separation is something the country must reckon with, as the existing infrastructure is not equipped to properly support children and incarcerated mothers. The impact of incarceration and separation on children are deep and devastating. The economic and emotional impacts echo throughout lifetimes and across generations. Family reunification is an extremely resource-intensive legal process. For the nearly 1 million mothers who are released each year, support and resources are scarce for completing this process, let alone finding secure housing and steady employment necessary for reunification. Check the show notes for more information and resources. Let's get back to Pam.
As a returning citizen for mothers, what do you feel like they need from government, from the social system, to help them really reintegrate and reconnect with their family?
I've said this before and I'll say it again. One of the things that surprised me when I started doing this work, because like I said, I felt for the sisters. But when I started doing reentry, it amazed me when I started asking the men who came to my office for services, what do you want? Their first thing would be, give me a house and give me a job. But when I talked to the sisters, 99% of the time, just like I did behind the walls, they would say, Miss Pam, help me to become whole again. Help me to get over my drug addiction. Help me to deal with, to come better from the trauma experiences that I have, and help me reconnect with my children.
Yeah.
So I would push for those things, like I said in my call to action. Help justice-impacted women, rehabilitate their lives. How do we do this? Giving them all the trauma-informed services that they need, giving them all the CBT services that they need, help them to get into programming. If they need an extra, everybody is not the same. There's no cookie-cutter situation with regards to justice-impacted women. So have people who will do assessments and then follow through on those assessments. Hold people in positions accountable, not because you got a grant to do this. You won't just, whatever you do, file some papers, but no one is actually looking at the results of the population that you said you're serving. So I will really push that government put policies in place to help women in the things that I just talked about, but also do the due diligence to make sure that the organizations that are getting the monies to do the work, they are actually doing it.
Yeah, it sounds like more so long-term care and paying attention to the results.
Exactly.
To make sure that you're really doing the work.
Right. Not names on paper, but actual bodies.
Right.
Let's do a side visit to the women that you say that you're supposed to be helping.
Yeah.
One of the things I really want to add to is that we should have trainings in place behind the walls. Start getting women involved in serious parenting training classes. Start having interviews with these women. What do you want to do when you come home? Could we help you get a job? Would you like to be trained in something? And start putting those trainings in place behind the walls. I'm a proponent of pre-release programming, but also post-release. So what you start behind the walls, you can continue when you get out.
Thank you so much, Ms. Pam.
Thank you.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. This is Diane Corman-Levy, and I hope you enjoyed listening to Pam's story and her personal experiences with incarceration and how it impacted her life. I am now delighted to speak with Jackie Johnson, who was a somatic healing justice art therapist and the clinical director at Sankofa Healing Studio. Welcome, Jackie.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me. I am honored to be here.
Well, I'm so delighted that you decided to join us and to be interviewed and be part of this important podcast. So let's just start out with just briefly talking about Sankofa Healing Center and the work you do there with respect to incarcerated women.
Yeah, so Sankofa Healing Studio really centers healing, right? Using visual art, storytelling, and healing circles. Unlike many approaches to support traumatic experiences and recovery that are oftentimes cognitive-based, Sankofa Healing Studio really is a bottom-up approach. What does that mean? Like that whole somatic piece? It means that we really understand that trauma lives in our bodies. That being said, really addressing how do we carry trauma within our bodies? How does it show up in the ways that we see ourselves in the world? How we connect with others, and just overall our well-being, right? Really centering mental wellness, not mental illness. And I specifically do weekly art therapy groups with incarcerated women here in Philadelphia that centers, what has happened to you, which I think sometimes we forget to do. And that is what Sankofa really centers in looking at healing justice approaches. We want to be able to fill the gaps so that people do have access to the healing and the spaces that they need to be the best versions of themselves.
Yeah, I love how you connect trauma and healing and justice, and how addressing trauma and really incorporating healing and wellness into any justice-oriented program is critical. So I love that. We'll dig a little deeper into that. So we heard Pam share her story about the decision she made in the context of abuse and trauma that led to drug addictions, financial desperation, and eventually incarceration, which has impacted her life forever. Let's just briefly talk about the relationship between abuse, trauma, and incarceration. In your experience, how many women who are incarcerated experience trauma, and how can trauma lead to incarceration?
Wow. It's a complex question with a very not complex answer. The vast majority of women have experienced, I see studies that may say 85 to 90% of incarcerated women have experienced trauma. I will say all of the women that I've worked with have experienced trauma. And I guess it kind of starts with, what do we even look or how do we see the experiences within the carceral system and systemic oppression? How do we even view that as how it impacts on people? And for me, just being involved in a system in and of itself is trauma, meaning every single woman who was impacted by this system has some sort of significant history of trauma just within that piece of it. But the reality is, so many have high ACE scores. And we think about that, we're looking at basic needs not being met, physical, sexual, mental abuse, not having access to basic resources is really a systemic thing, not an individual thing. It's something we need to look at collectively. And it's a very, very close connection. When we have traumatic experiences, it changes who we are and how we see the world. And so often, trauma really leads to things like substance misuse, because we're trying to avoid or numb the pain that, unfortunately, spaces aren't created to have us really be able to sit with some of it and have the supports that we really need. And when we think about criminal behavior and people use terms like that, really what it is desperation of survival in so many instances. So yeah.
Yeah, I just think that's a really important point, how systems that are grounded in what we call racialized patriarchy, so at the intersection of gender and race, how just interacting with different systems in our country, in our region, are traumatic. Yeah. And I don't think people think about that. I think they think of it as one person doing something to another, but of course the systems are made up of people, but it's systemic, right? That is something that I think we really need to highlight. And so it's hard to get away from it, particularly, I'm going to say, as a Black woman, because of the intersection of gender and race.
Yeah, it's in the air that we breathe. It is in the air that we breathe. And we also know that women of color and Black women are impacted at much higher rates. And that's something that we really need to have conversation about. Or what is the long-term impact, not only for the individual, but for the entire family and the entire community?
And I want to briefly talk about how trauma is in our bodies, not just it's in our minds, in our bodies. And I want to talk a little briefly about, this is another question I wasn't planning to ask you, but intergenerational trauma. Yeah. So I often say white people, because of white supremacy, pass down assets because of the way policies have been worked and how it's favored white people. Many times people of color pass down trauma because of racism and the historical roots of this country. So intergenerational trauma too, how is that playing out?
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's twofold. As you mentioned, the idea with white supremacy being passed down, well, what happens is whether within a Black body there's intergenerational trauma passed down or not, there are still impacts of the intergenerational patriarchy and white supremacist culture that creates new traumas. So with respect, that absolutely, it's very difficult to thrive, right, within a system that is not built for you to thrive. And the ways that we see ourselves is going to impact the ways that we parent, the ways that we are able to connect with each other, which is only exacerbated by exactly what you spoke about, this continual supremacist culture and way of being within our society that only creates new harms on top of the other harms that still haven't been significantly addressed. So yeah, really complex there.
Yeah.
But I think you bring up a very, very good point. And even when we are trying to sit with joy, having access is paramount. Yeah. And unfortunately, within the societies that we have and the structures that are built in this at this point, still access is not there.
Yeah,
not in equitable ways.
No, it's not. So, how is trauma related to financial insecurity? How would you describe the relationship between trauma and financial insecurity, particularly the gender wealth gap, which disproportionately impacts women of color?
Yeah. Trauma is going to really impact, and it makes it more difficult in maintaining employment. To make it really clear, when people are feeling depressed or they're feeling anxious, they don't always want to be around other people, right? Mm-hmm. We may not feel good, and we all may have a bad day, and you wake up and you can't get out of the bed. There's just so many things going on in your life. And getting out of the bed and getting in the shower may be a difficult thing to do. When you're looking at someone who has complex trauma, complex PTSD, the rates of anxiety and depression are even that much more prevalent, meaning I may have a difficult time just functioning from day to day. And functioning is absolutely not thriving, meaning I can't be the best version of myself. That's going to separate me from being in certain kinds of employment positions because those positions themselves may be triggering for me. It's going to separate me from opportunities of education. And even with that, one, you have to pay for education. And even if you have access to education, what winds up happening if we're talking about trauma living in our bodies, trauma also impacts that part of our brain that affects learning and language. So I am physically not able to be my best self to do the type of learning that is necessary to learn to take on new skills. So there's just so many compounding aspects of all of it.
Yeah, well said. Well said. So how does incarceration exacerbate trauma and economic insecurity? So you said many women that end up being in prison have been traumatized, probably have PTSD, have trauma in their bodies and their minds, and then they go to prison. And how does that exacerbate trauma?
In and of itself, prison is based on isolation. It's not based within community. It's not based within healing. It is based within a carceral system. I need to punish you and I need to separate you. And when we think about mental wellness is rooted within connection. being able to have supports. Those same support systems do not exist within the systems that we have. So incarceration is actually a deliberate a interaction, right? This interaction that takes people away from their family, that takes people away from possible support systems that they need. And what it does is blame an individual for not having access to resources that were never offered to them. So it's just in so many ways. And then you have a cluster of people who have all been traumatized in so many different ways, that are all in a survival mode. And then we put them together in very tight spaces and expect things, to just be amazing and everyone's getting along. And that's just not it. Not to even mention that the system itself and the people who work within the systems themselves have often been traumatized. And the ways that they then interact and perpetuate oppression. There's just no escaping the damage and harm that it creates.
And then we let them go back to society, right? After being traumatized over and over again. So last question, I could talk to you forever, Jackie. I love talking to you. What is your call to action? So what do we need to do to address trauma and foster healing, well-being, and financial security among formerly incarcerated women?
Well, it has to be a comprehensive approach. We really need to look at true holistic approaches that address trauma. And I do mean holistic. We need to look at what does financial security actually mean and how that can be put into to place. And we have to address the systemic issues, because even if we create spaces of healing for people, but we don't address some of the systemic issues, people will get caught up into these cycles that they themselves did not create. So my call to action is really for us to continue to connect and also to look at communication. It's about 93% of our communication is nonverbal, but we want to keep talking our way out of things versus looking at power systems and things created and what messages are being sent. Do people feel welcome? Do they feel seen and heard and validated and valued? That's really one of the things we need to start at. And we really can start at that as a profession and within the field itself. How do we now show up differently? By decolonizing the same spaces that are creating harm.
How do we show up differently? By decolonizing our minds and the spaces that we show up in. That is a powerful question and a powerful call to action. So Jackie, like I said, I wish we could spend a lot more time. Thank you so much. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for your commitment to this work. We need more people like you. And just thank you for being part of this podcast. And is there a website that we want to share with folks about the Healing Studio?
Yes. Again, thank you so much for inviting me. Sankofa Healing Studio is a nonprofit here in Philadelphia. It is sankofahealingstudio.org. And that's S as in Sam, A, N as in Nancy, KOFA, healingstudio.org, because this is a place to heal.
Thank you, Jackie. And please take advantage of Jackie and the incredible work she does every day. So again, thank you so much. And we appreciate everything. And be well, stay safe.
Yes, you as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Razor Wire Fence. This podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Women's Way, Change the Narrative Fellows, Love Now Media, and Little Drummer Boy Recordings.